Stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch when they make you crazy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of TRD Talks Live. I'm Erik Engquist, Senior Managing Editor here at The Real Deal, and I'm happy to be joined today by three of our borough presidents, Gale Brewer of Manhattan, James Oddo of Staten Island, and Erik Adams of Brooklyn. But before we get started, we have a sponsor today. So we're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, Suri Kassir. Go ahead, Suri.
Erik, it's so nice to be here and to support The Real Deal. You guys do such important work informing New Yorkers about really important issues. And I'm delighted to be sponsoring this panel with three important elected officials, Borough President of Manhattan, Gale Brewer, Borough President of Brooklyn, Erik Adams, and Borough President of Staten Island, Jimmy Oddo. As a founder of New York's top government relations firm, I see myself as a strategist, a problem solver, and a partner to government. We focus on putting a lot of energy into finding creative solutions to move the city forward to serve the needs of all its residents. And that means bringing together elected officials, government, business, community advocates to understand how to create common ground to create the best outcome for New York City. In order to restart this economy post-COVID, it's super important, I think, for all of us to understand what's happening and what are the unique qualities and issues for each borough. Just to give you some examples, the Bronx has experienced the highest death rates and the highest positive COVID rates relative to its population. Queens has suffered the highest number of positive cases and the highest number of fatalities. 28% of New York City's essential workers live in Brooklyn, and 75% of them are people of color. East New York has the highest death rate of any neighborhood in New York City. And Staten Island has the second highest positive rate of the boroughs relative to its population. The impact of COVID on tourism, for example, in Manhattan is staggering. The estimates are that the city could lose 500,000 tourism-related jobs in hotels, restaurants, museums, and theaters. We're advocating for projects and clients in each of those boroughs, each seeking to reinvigorate economic activity. Restarting New York and bringing back thousands and millions of jobs will take tremendous ingenuity and collaboration. The people in front of you are the people who know this city so well and are going to be an important part of the solution and bringing back the economy. I personally am an optimist, and I look forward to working and partnering with government to bring back this economy. Thank you so much, Erik, for what you're doing.
Thanks very much, Suri. And we'll get right into it. By way of very brief introductions, Erik Adams is from my home borough. He is a former police captain and a state senator, and he could be our next mayor. He, like the other two guests today, was elected borough president in 2013, has been serving since 2014. Gale Brewer was a deputy public advocate, for those of you who have good political memories. Then she was in the city council for 12 years, and she is basically an institution in Manhattan politics. And Jimmy Oddo was in the city council, I believe, for 15 years. He is a Republican that even Democrats could like. And apparently they do, because there are more Democrats than Republicans on Staten Island, and he is probably the most popular elected official in that borough. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
First question I wanted to ask each of you briefly, before we get to real estate, what is the number one thing that you are hearing from your constituents during this shutdown? Gale?
Well, it's three. We obviously have a constituent office on 125th Street. It's a storefront. We're not there that much, but the number ringing goes to the cell phones of 6 staff people. Unemployment. I know state officials are getting that. People are not getting their checks. Number 2, food. We've been focusing on that for the seniors and the NYCHA residents. People originally didn't get food at all. It's better. And 3, Manhattan construction, because originally there were, 800 sites that were deemed essential. And now, as of this afternoon, it's 8,521. So people don't want construction when they're home all day next door. So those are the three issues that we get the most calls about. And of course, what's interesting is during a normal, non-COVID, it's housing, housing, housing. And it will be in the future.
Although I will say, noise complaints, I was surprised to read that noise complaints were so prevalent during the shutdown period, because on my block, it's the quietest it's ever been because there's no traffic. Erik Adams of Brooklyn, what are you hearing mostly from your constituents?
I agree with Gail. Food has been a major issue. And as I'm on the food lines, giveaway lines, pantry lines, the faces of those who are asking for food, those faces have definitely changed. I've been partnering with Campaign Against Hunger, Dr. Melody Samuel, who is amazing. She's reaching her 3 millionth meal. But the second is also their altruism around our first responders, the lack of PPEs. And they have been really concerned about that. What are we doing? And lastly, the lack of clarity on testing, of the fact that we have really under-tested the outer boroughs is troubling to me. But those are the three top issues that we get a lot of calls. Like Gail, our phones have been transferred to our staffs at home, but we're still dealing with these issues. The presence of COVID-19 does not mean the disappearance of those issues that were here long before this pandemic.
And Jimmy Otto, what are Staten Islanders calling about?
I think in the beginning of this crisis, much like the other boroughs and localities all over the country, frankly, we were getting calls constantly on behalf of loved ones who are either first responders, or our biggest employer on Staten Island is the Northwell system, Staten Island University Hospital, on behalf of their loved ones who were healthcare professionals. It was chasing PPE and desperate pleas by family members for their loved ones for PPE. I think more recently, we've gotten lots of calls and lots of heartbreaking calls from families with loved ones in nursing homes. It continues to be a challenge, and it has been for the last several weeks, even prior to sort of it becoming part of the media's attention. We were seeing issues in our nursing home. And lastly, I think similar to what Erik mentioned, folks have lots of questions on Staten Island about education, specifically for our special needs kids who go to school 12 months of the year, we're seeing lots of self-harm and lots of confusion, lots of questions still on the education front, not many answers so far.
It's interesting what Borough President Adams said about the faces on the food lines look different. I saw a line outside Barclays a few days ago, and yeah, it wasn't what struck you. It looked like a line for a concert. I mean, you couldn't really tell the difference from that. But let me ask you this. Mark Levine, who's a councilman in Gale's borough of Manhattan, he tweeted yesterday that the shelter at home message was sort of too limited because not everyone is now sheltering at home. People are starting to venture out. And his question was, shouldn't we be hearing more from our public officials about what to do, how to assess your risks if you're not just sheltering at home? I mean, is that a concern for you? I mean, Gail, you probably saw the news coverage of people venturing out, and some people, I don't know how they managed to get seated in some dining establishments in your borough. But are you worried that we are not providing people information on what to do if they're not just staying at home?
Yes, because guess what's happening? We've all been through this. We all started out with PPE and food and all of those challenges. I got about 6 emails today from people who see that the door is open, the gate is down, but the gym is full. And so that's what's going to happen now. And then the other thing I get the email about is people are wearing a mask, but they're not covering their nose, and therefore they could in fact be spreading. We always get the social distancing and the challenges between the police and the community, but I would say this messaging has been challenging from the beginning. Let me give an example. Testing is incredibly challenging as a understanding that you have to get it, but I want it to be like in California. In California, everybody's welcome to get tested. If I show up, I don't have symptoms. If I show up at a testing site, I'll get tested, but I don't know that. So I think the messages have been confusing. They're confusing for seniors. I'm a big supporter. So the seniors, they're supposed to stay home, but at the beginning, they have to go grab and go their food. They're not supposed to stay home. They're supposed to get the food delivered. And the reason I say that is when you talk about messages, I think it is confusing for people right now. They are going to go out. The weather is nicer. But are we really clear on what they should or shouldn't be doing? So,
Jimmy Oddo, are you concerned about that? I mean,
yeah, I think from our professional experience as elected officials and our political experience as people who have run campaigns as candidates and as operatives, I think we understand the need of clear messaging and the need to repeat that message over and over. And in today, in various forms. You got to do it via text, via audio, visual, memes, graphics. And I think there has been differing messages. I do want to strike a blow, if I might, for personal responsibility. Listen, in a hyper-opinionated age, you have to grab onto science. And science shifts, and people are making decisions based on the best science that's available at the time. So yeah, the professionals, the experts have given us different pieces of advice, but some of this is simple and some of this is universal. And there's nothing hard about understanding that you wear a mask to help the next person, or washing your hands often, or keeping a distance. And in my borough, and I saw it in Gale's borough, and unless there was this great influx of Republicans, it seems that this is bipartisan in the selfishness. And in Staten Island, it's like, I'm ripping the mask off, I'm a patriot. I think that's BS. And I think, so while I do think that the messaging has been convoluted, I think that's natural for a pandemic of this proportion, I do want to not give people a pass on personal responsibility. And I see this macho America nonsense, and I don't buy it for a second.
You know, that's a good segue to Borough President Adams, because, you know, every time I see the mayor, he talks about the disparities, and there's no question that COVID-19 has hit the minority community especially hard. But Borough President Adams, your message has been a little different, right? You have been, correct me if I'm wrong, much more focused than the mayor on what people can do in terms of diet and exercise and taking care of themselves, so that if they do, get infected, their immune systems are stronger and their bodies are more able to fight this off. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm not alone on that. Jimmy has been amazing on Staten Island as we continue to push this. And it is disheartening to me and troubling that when you listen to the conversation on the federal, the state and city level, no one is talking about the prevention aspect. We should have fought COVID-19 on an intervention and prevention. Intervention is if you have it, make sure you get the appropriate medical care. Prevention is how do we prevent people from getting it, number one, and number two, how do we strengthen immune systems so that you will have an ability to fight off any type of virus, even during the flu season. It is troubling to me that we continue down this road of having sick care. We don't have health care. We have sick care. You get sick, we treat your symptoms. And then, as we announced today with Councilman Kalos, the bill that we announced, when you look at the food that we are feeding people with pre-existing conditions, we're actually sending them into a very dangerous environment. And so I believe that there's a combination of government participation and everyday responsible behavior by the residents.
You know, I just an aside, I don't think you get as many votes by talking about that as you do talking about how people are victims and the world is unfair, which is a lot of what we hear from the mayor. But I mean, is that something that you focus group, or you poll, or you're just going by intuition when you deliver that message?
I'm not driven by politics. I'm driven by purpose. And when I lost my eyesight and the doctor told me I would be blind in a year and I was legally blind, I had to turn in my driver's license. And he stated that I was going to lose some fingers and toes from advanced stages of type 2 diabetes. It's time for us to talk about saving the lives of families. And they may not want to hear it, but I'm going to be very clear as long as I'm in public life to state that we have to change the direction of a broken healthcare system nationally and particularly in New York. We have two healthcare systems in New York City, one for the affluent and those who are dependent on those safety net hospitals. And we must have a real conversation about the health in this city.
Speaking of the dichotomy between the affluent and the not, Gale, you have a lot of wealthy people in your borough, probably more than anyone else. And basically all of them have skipped town.
Eric, not all of them. No, I'm right.
Spike Lee is still there.
No, 5% or 420,000 people, and some of them lived in Brooklyn. So
well, here's my question. Now, Spike Lee said, "I'm still here, and everyone else should have stayed because this is the epicenter." I mean, do you begrudge those folks who skipped town, or did they help matters at all by leaving?
I have a lot of friends who skip town, and you have friends. We all have friends who skip town. You know what I don't like happening? Some of them signed up for the census in their new temporary location. So I just want them to know that they need to redo their application for the census and use your New York City address, because it will be cleaned out in the wash and the New York City address will trump wherever you are temporarily. But I don't begrudge them. I want them to come back. I worry a little bit that some of them will stay where they are, but it is, Eric, only 5% of residents of the entire city of New York.
Hey, Erik, can I go back to the comments that Borough President Adams made, because I think it's so important. If this has to be one of the takeaways and one of the byproducts of this pandemic, and that it has to be a health revolution in this country. And I think Eric Adams has been ahead of his time as an elected official, and it's not politically popular. It's not politically popular to talk about obesity and diabetes and hypertension and challenge people on their lifestyles. He's been courageous. Your colleague, Errol Lewis, I find myself saying at least once a week now, reading Errol's comments, Errol Lewis is right. And the reality is we as Americans have been setting ourselves up as bowling pins, waiting for something like this pandemic and this virus to act like a bowling ball to knock us down. And the data is right in front of us. 1 in 2 Americans will be obese by 2030. In 1960, fewer than 1% of Americans had diabetes. And now you have 30 million who are diabetic and 70 to 80 million who are pre-diabetic. And this is created the atmosphere. And this virus has sought out people with these pre-existing conditions. And this needs to be fight not only about one small portion about health insurance, this needs to be fought about how we subsidize food in this country, the tax policy about food in this country. And I said to Erik privately, and I've said this publicly, I will run through a brick wall when I hear Eric Adams talk about health and wellness, because it is so important. And this pandemic has demonstrated, and I think validated, his work and the work that we've tried to do at Staten Island.
We could do a whole show on health policy, and I am glad that you mentioned it's not just about personal choices, but the system is geared to steer people to cheap calories, which is, there is a government role for sure. Let's move on a little bit to, let me ask, before we get to real estate, just one more quick question for Jimmy. You represent kind of the so-called forgotten borough, and the mayor is pretty despised out there where you are, but you've gotten along with him actually fairly well. You could probably make a lot more points with your constituents if you just trolled de Blasio all the time.
Oh yeah.
But you did kind of call him out for not sending enough supplies to Staten Island, and the mayor came back and said, well, I'm sending supplies and people where the need is greatest, which is like Elmhurst and central Brooklyn. So, I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, he subsequently sent 60 nursing staff to Rumsey. And it would have been nice if he would have sent it during the month of April, but we we took it in the month of May. Listen, I get by now that every person in every other borough rolls their eyes when Staten Island claims we've been treated dissimilarly. But when you're sitting in my seat and you see day after day the mayor frame this issue through the prism of health and hospitals, and Staten Island doesn't have a health and hospital in the entire borough, not Bill de Blasio's fault alone. Two pro-Staten Island mayors and Rudy Giuliani and Mike Bloomberg didn't do anything about it.
There's no public hospital there as well.
Right, there's no public hospital. So you can't punish us a second time when you're doling out PPE or you're doling out additional staff that you've hired, nursing staff, and then we don't have the public hospital on the front end, and now on the back end, you're not giving us our fair share of help. And it spilled over one morning and I dropped an F-bomb on Twitter, which if you tell my mom about it, I will hunt you down. But I was frustrated, and I've tried to keep my frustration behind closed doors and to work proactively, because other than that, Staten Island will be in a municipal wilderness with this administration. And I've tried to leverage my personal relationship with the mayor. It's worked. Mm-hmm. But every now and then you got to throw a rhetorical chair across the room to get people's attention. And eventually it did, albeit a little bit past the peak.
I could even see you throwing a literal chair across the room. It has happened before.
And you know what, Erik, and that's a larger issue that happened here. We failed to properly manage our assets and have an equitable distribution of resources in real time. You can't continue to run cities in annually, weekly, or even daily revisionist reports. You must have a real-time apparatus. And we were clueless for at least 3 or 4 weeks on real-time data, real-time dashboards, and that's problematic. And you didn't see the resources going where they should have gone to.
Erik, to Borough President Adams' point, I'll say this in defense of the mayor. In the first 2.5 weeks when we were all chasing PPE, my point of contact, my best ally in the de Blasio administration was Bill de Blasio. And I told him at one point, I've just reread a bunch of our emails, and it seemed like it was Bill de Blasio and Jimmy Oddo versus some of the people that work for Bill de Blasio. He absolutely helped me cut through that. But to Borough President Adams' point, it's no way to run the candy store.
Isn't that amazing? Like you hear the mayor on Brian Lair's radio show, and people call in order to get their services. Or there was one guy who said, you guys have been asking for food donations. I run a catering service. I can make lots of meals. I can deliver them, but I literally can't get through to the city. I email, I call 311. No one ever gets back to me. In order for him to provide free food, he had to talk to the mayor directly on the radio.
And let me tell you what happened, Erik. This is what we did wrong. We managed this crisis based on what could have happened, that we ignored what was happening. That's the scale of a crisis. Crisis leadership, you don't figure out what could happen in the city. You have to deal with what is happening at the time, and then you gauge what is going to happen. We learned that from 9/11.
I want to go to Gale. I want to pivot a little bit to real estate, because that's what our audience is most passionate about. Gale, I tweeted the other day that
I heard, Erik.
I just find it ironic that you are not a fan of tall buildings, and you represent Manhattan, which has more tall buildings than any county on the planet. I mean, how do you explain that? Can you put that in perspective for us?
Yes, because my constituents in the neighborhoods, they don't want tall buildings either. We want contextual buildings. We want ones that have a great deal of affordable housing and not condos, which are not usually even occupied. We know we've done 159 ULURPs, so that's more than all the other boroughs, maybe even combined. And so we work really hard. We have 6 people in land use. But for me, when you have, you buy up all the air rights, then you figure out how to do lot mergers, and nobody even knows you're doing it because you don't have to tell anybody. And then you put in a community facility, and maybe you stick in some, mechanicals that are so way out of context, and then you have a tall building.
I understand that. Those are the rules that the government has created. I mean,
And we're trying to change some of those rules, particularly we're working with city planning on the mechanicals. We've had some success there, and we would like to have some knowledge if there is air rights purchase or lot merger. We'd like to know that. So I think that, we have a big challenge in terms of these tall buildings. So when we're doing Manhattan is unique in that sense. We need more affordable housing. That is the number one need in the city of New York.
It's funny you mentioned, when you said city planning, I thought a little shiver went through Jimmy Oddo right there. Here's a quote from Jimmy Oddo. "City planning is not a friend to the people of Staten Island and has demonstrated an indifference and a disdain for the borough. They don't care about the will of people, and they acted as consultants for high-density development projects." What is your deal with city planning? Aren't they just nice city planners?
I should have saved the F-bomb for them instead of for Mayor de Blasio from a few weeks ago. But let me say, when this all settles down on COVID, to quote Marcellus Wallace from Pulp Fiction, city planning, "I ain't through with you by a damn sight." Because they are an insular, arrogant group. And I hope whether it's Mayor Adams or Mayor Johnson or Mayor Stringer, they go in there and they bring that agency back to the communities, and they reflect the values of the community. And they don't care about irrational development on Staten Island in residential communities. We've been fighting this fight on private roads and General City Law 36 for 5 years. The BSA chair, Marjorie Perlmutter, has been heroic in being the first BSA chair to actually listen to the argument. And guess what? She agrees that GCL 36 has been misapplied.
I heard that she actually came out to Staten Island and visited. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, this is an obscure city law, but basically says you can't build a new development unless it fronts a public street, a mapped public street. And I think what you're referring to, you had a project there was originally, I think, 250 homes where a lot of them are on private streets.
It's many projects, and it's the difference between, it's allowing what was intended to be the exception to the rule to be a loophole that you could drive a Mack truck through. And that has resulted in shabby construction. There are two paths. There's one path that is consistent with the law that says agencies actually have to do analysis of the project, traffic, sewer implications, water runoff, before they build it. Oh my God, the temerity of the borough president from Staten Island, that he wants us to abide by the clear language of the law, and he wants analysis of a project before it's built. Or you can get the get out of jail free card handed out like candy by the city of New York and it's a hardship. It's a hardship. Marjorie Perlmutter and her team actually read the law, studied the law, saw the actual application of that law and what it resulted in over 3 decades on Staten Island, and said there's a better way, there's a right way. And city planning, I'm not done with you.
You're the one guy I can forgive for being anti-development at times because you don't have the transportation network on Staten Island to support high-density development. Gale Brewer, Erik Adams, you do have infrastructure that could support high-density development. Borough President Adams, you have been, I think, the most receptive to real estate's argument that it is a contributor to the city, a contributor to the economy, not just an exploiter of it. And I wondered if you could just put your impressions of the real estate industry in perspective, because we are in a political era where it's popular to oppose real estate.
Well, it's not based on just opinion. It's based on facts. Let's go back after September 11th. We had an almost $4.8 billion budget deficit. Who did we go to bail us out? The real estate industry. 2018, we saw a collapse of our financial industries. Who did we go to? We went to the real estate industry. Over 50% of our tax revenue comes from the real estate industry. And oftentimes when we think of the real estate industry, we think of those bad acting landlords. We don't think about the mom and pop who bought an 8-story building and they're doing the right thing. We don't think about the number of people who contribute to just seeing our city build up. If we lose our real estate industry, is like Texas losing oil. That is the foundation of our city. Now, we must make sure we're responsible. We must make sure that we don't have bad acting landlords that displace innocent tenants. But we must be clear that this is a city where we build, house people, and we use our real estate industry as part of the economic foundation of this city. And I will continue to say that.
You know, Gale, I have to give you some credit because even though you oppose a lot of tower projects, you do show up year after year at the Real Estate Board of New York's annual gala. I just wonder how those conversations go when you walk in.
They know me very well, as does Jimmy, because we serve together in the city council. And I'm just going to speak my mind. I have a huge constituency. They know that. And I will meet with anybody. But they're not going to run ripshop over my neighborhoods and build buildings that are totally out of context. We have two right now. Michael Dell, whom you know from the computer world, is trying to build a building that cantilevers over a whole community on the Upper West Side. And we don't think it's legal. We have another one on 3rd Avenue, on 1059 3rd Avenue, that the drawings, I know Jimmy talks about city planning. You should hear me talk about Department of Buildings. They don't read anything. They don't read the material. So these communities have to hire their own engineer, their own land use attorney to be able to read the plans that the Department of Buildings is supposed to read. And we have to then spend days and months and years pointing out all the fallacies that the Department of Buildings did not read. So those are the developers that I have challenges with. There are a lot of them. They come and meet with you. You may agree or disagree. You can have an honest conversation. I do wish we would have more affordable housing. If you're going to build a tall building as 100% condo in 2021 or 2020 with or without this horrible COVID, we need this affordable housing. Just take a look at what we're dealing with right now.
So do you guys agree with the mayor's housing philosophy? I mean, his policy is basically, let's subsidize affordable housing with market rate housing. So we redistrict, and if you do a project in a redistricted area, you have to provide roughly 30% affordable units along with your 70% market rate. And so that seemed to be working for a while. And then all of a sudden, you can't even rezone anymore because people in the city council say a rezoning is gentrification, rezoning forces people out, rezoning makes rents go up. I mean, all these crazy arguments that are not really based in science or economics or evidence. So I wondered what your take, Jimmy, I want to pivot you here because, you had a rezoning in Staten Island. I think you basically supported it. And then the city councilwoman, Debbie Rose, she pulled out of it the middle income housing from that, and you basically threw a fit.
Yeah, so very early on in the de Blasio administration, they invited all 5 borough presidents to the cow at City Hall, and Alicia Glenn told us there's going to be a 5-borough affordable housing program. And I told the deputy mayor at the time that any type of housing, luxury housing, even senior housing, is seen through the prism of Staten Island of our history, which was the wild, wild west. They allowed an island to be developed, and any sort of density is seen as a negative. So I said, you have to couch it in terms of infrastructure. And I pointed them to the Bay Street corridor. If it's going to work on any place on Staten Island, it will work in the Bay Street corner if you address infrastructure. Well, fast forward 5 years, the administration did nothing on infrastructure and ran the rezoning through the city council. And then the exclamation point was they took away the workforce housing, which is amazing to me that, my dad was a motorman, which is now called a train operator. They could call them motormen back then because they were all men, but it's train operator. He drove trains all around New York City. Between my dad's motorman salary and my mom working at H&R Block, they theoretically would not be within the scope and the salary range of who could have lived in workforce housing. They actually stripped that out, and council members would give a speech how workforce housing was a terrible thing. This is, I hate to get political, but I say to myself, this is the Democratic Party. This is the party that was the party of working people saying that a young teacher and a young nurse, a young train operator and a young bus driver who are married can't live in this rezoning. They're the one group of people on Staten Island who won't be allowed to live.
Right, because their income band was too high. Their income band, or if you put their household income together, they were at 130% of the
could afford market rate,
income.
just missed market rate, but didn't fit within the affordable status. So you can't live there. And it strikes me as so bizarre. And so the administration completely and intentionally kicked the can down the road, kicked the can down the road, kicked the can down the road on infrastructure. And Staten Island has lived that.
Well, forget about infrastructure for the moment. Let's just talk about the demographics of the housing plan, because what happens is the council members come in and they want, 100% affordable. They want 60% of area median income, and they want subsidies for all of these, because that's the only way that you can build an economically viable project for all low income, is you have to heavily subsidize it. Well, guess what? City is broke now. So I don't know if that changes things, but have any of you, really called out city council members for this line that they keep pushing, where we're going to end up with very little, if any, development at all and no addition to the housing supply? Eric Adams.
Well, clearly the mayor is reshaping his housing policies, and we're going to have to really focus on the win-win. I'm a big middle-class housing, like Jimmy indicated. I believe that that teacher and that accountant must have a place to stay. And if you look at United Way's report in 2019, I believe it was, 40% of New Yorkers have a sufficiency deficit. And so it really doesn't matter the whole definition of low income and who can actually live in this city is something that we need to redefine. It is not affordable for a large number of New Yorkers. And if we don't look at middle class, middle income New Yorkers, we're going to hurt this city. And so I think it's imperative that as the mayor refocus his housing plan, that we don't want to create an over-bloated homeless issue. And so we have to really look at low income, because if you don't, you're going to have a real issue around homelessness. But we also must mandate those who have those subsidized programs, vouchers and what have you, that they're able to find decent, affordable living. I think that's important. And that's one of the big challenges we're going to have down the road when we cycle out of COVID-19.
Now, Gale and Jimmy, you both served in the city council, where one council member can kill a rezoning in his district, even though theoretically all 51 are voting on it. So what's the implication of that? So Rafael Salamanca killed a rezoning while it was in its crib still. I mean, and so did Antonio Reynoso in Northern Brooklyn. So those rezonings won't happen, so it's not working, is it? Like this local control, you endorsed it when you're in the city council, did you not? Do you think we should get rid of that?
Well, I mean, in the city council, I supported the rezoning along the Hudson River that was from 59th to 61st Street, and it's being built with hopefully a small percentage. It could always be more of affordable. And now we've done, since I've been the borough president, we've sort of pivoted into the East Harlem that was started by the previous speaker. As you know, the one in Inwood is in litigation, but that one we were part of. And of course, the most successful is the East Midtown, which Dan Garodnick and I did, and that's a commercial area. But now we're working on Morningside Heights, and we're working in Soho, NoHo, and other ones. The reason I say that is the way that sometimes the mayor's office does it, not always, they don't. It's not just a local council member that can stop it. If you have a group of people who are really stakeholders, as was done in East Harlem, as was done in East Midtown, who have constant say and not one council member, then you do have the support of the neighborhood, and then the neighborhood.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Soho, NoHo, you're going to have people who are opposing this who already have housing. Right. So there's nothing in it for them if new housing is created. In fact, it's bad. They would rather have no new housing created because they don't want any more neighbors, and it makes their own housing more valuable if no new housing is created. So let me ask Jimmy on this. You were in the city council for a long time, maybe the longest in the history since we've had term limits. What is your view on, how these council members respond just to whoever's yelling the loudest in the district. They don't think about, the broader city. They don't think about who might be able to move in the future.
I have to concede the point to you that we've essentially created a veto power for local council members. And I know that has negative citywide implications, but you're talking to a guy who is from the outer borough, happened to be a Republican, and this was the one chance that I had to equalize the playing field. And also, I was part of an institution, and Gale knows this all too well, that was trying to be a check on the executive, and we have a strong mayor structure in the city. So this was the one time that allowed me to speak eye to eye with the administration. I tried to use that power rationally. I know Gale Brewer always did. Some members will take it and take it too far, and I can see that. I see it through the institutional lens, and man, oh man, I don't want to give up that power. And even though I'm out, and if Eric Adams hires me one day, I may regret saying this, but I, for one, here in 2020 still vote to allow members to have that one opportunity to even the playing field institutionally.
I just want to say I'd vote for, the Staten Island Borough President for anything, just so we're clear.
By the way, Eric Adams, I have to give you credit. One project comes to mind is 80 Flatbush Avenue, which was a tower. It was 2 blocks from, the biggest transit hub in Brooklyn and one of the largest in the city. And you basically supported that project, almost as large as it was proposed, because it made sense to you that you would have high density right near mass transit, even though there were some homeowners, who had bought their houses in 1970 and, 3 or 4 row houses who didn't want a tower, anywhere near them.
I think nothing is more important to a human being and an American, as well as a New Yorker, is the right to housing. As a child, almost homeless, I know what it is to carry a shopping bag full of clothing to school every day because we were unsure if the marshals were going to throw us out. And how dare I have properties. How dare I say that a person does not have the right to housing? Let's be responsible. And when we build it, let's use our transportation corridors. I'm big on that in Brooklyn. Let's protect our inner streets. But my high volume areas, instead of having 5-story storage facilities, why shouldn't we have 5-story housing? Why shouldn't we have 8-story housing? And those who are in their homes and state, I don't want another building on my block, I say, how dare you? You need to go visit some of these homeless shelters and see families without a place to live. 100,000 children, our babies, don't have a permanent residency. And to folks who say that, I say, how dare you?
I want to ask, we only have about 3 minutes left, and I just want you to each briefly tell me, how do you think COVID is going to affect the future of real estate in your borough? And by that, I mean, work from home. Does that benefit Brooklyn? Does that benefit Staten Island, that maybe more people can work from home and not have to schlep into the city? And from Gale's point of view, is this a concern that millions of people are not going to be commuting to the city every day, supporting the small businesses and the other establishments there? Let me start with Jimmy, and then we'll go to Eric, and then Gale.
Yeah, I think you nailed it for us. For the borough that has the worst commute in the city and one of the worst commutes in the nation, the idea of being able to work from home is a welcome change. I also think we're home of the JFK 8, that big Amazon facility, and a lot of other e-commerce entities looking for land on our West Shore. And e-commerce, is real crucial during things like this. I think those properties and those projects get a boost, and we'll continue to see jobs along what we call the jobs coast of the West Shore of Staten Island.
Mm-hmm. Or President Adams?
Real issue, and we have to rethink our employment environment. There's no ignoring the fact that some people who have traveled home to do their employment, they're going to stay there. And we have to reshape how do we use some of the vacant spaces, and how maybe even think about turning some of that into housing, 100% affordable. But clearly, the dynamics have definitely changed. Many of my staff, I'm going to have them start, doing their jobs from home. Of the days of having 100% of people inside in office space, it has changed. And anyone that is ignoring that really don't have their finger on the pulse.
Gale, that's got to be a concern for you, right? Because you depend on these commuters.
It's a concern because obviously there is a lot of commercial space in the borough of Manhattan, and all of the commercial real estate people are nervous because people have not only learned to work at home and enjoyed it, but guess what? Going to save money for the company that is renting at a vast cost per square foot. Number one. Number two, the other change I think that's going to exist is we need open streets, plaza, maybe taking over some of the parking lanes and moving the restaurants and the open outdoor cafes and changing law so they can do that. And that's going to be a big change for people. And just because the last mile, you get off the train, the last mile has to be safe and something that you want to go to. So those are all big differences that I think will be very challenging for the commercial sector. As Erik suggested, if we have less in the commercial and the zoning allows, obviously I'm pushing for affordable housing because that is the number one issue, lack of, so that people don't have to commute. I think also in the residential areas, there will be more work from home. And so how will those small businesses pivot to be more responsive to that new resident, quote unquote? So there are a lot of changes. And of course, we have to keep people in their homes as much as we can right up to August 20th and beyond. That September rent is making us all very, very nervous.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I agree. Everyone wants affordable housing. I think we should do a whole show on how do we actually get it, because one thing to be for it, another thing to come up with a plan that actually produces it. I would like to thank our three guests, Borough President James Oddo, Staten Island, Borough President Gale Brewer of Manhattan, Borough President Erik Adams of Brooklyn. And I would like to thank our sponsor, Suri Kasira, the #1 grossing lobbyist in New York City, for sponsoring today's TRD Talk. Come back Friday at 5 o'clock. We're going to take you inside the Real Deal newsroom to talk to our editors and reporters about the most controversial topics in real estate. See you at 5 o'clock on Friday. Good night, everyone.